This is History 3. And I used to call this education the yoga of civilization. And like any kind of a yoga, it takes a lot of practice in order to perfect your technique. But unlike a yoga, which is just simply, say, a hatha yoga or a karma yoga, a really complete yogi also masters the yoga of jnana, consciousness, and doesn't forget bhakti yoga, devotion. And when all four of those yogas are brought together, that's called Raja Yoga. A very simple 20th century précis of this kind of yoga was made by Swami Vivekananda. And the Vedanta societies around the world still sell his little books on the four yogas. And putting all four together, one gets a Raja Yoga. So this education is like a Raja Yoga. But we've seen one of the stubborn structures of reality is that in terms of its manifestation, in terms of the real being real, it likes to pair. One of the fundamental reductions that certainty has about the pairing is that we have great confidence in identity, A equals A. We think of identity in terms of an equation, A equals A, 1 equals 1, and that somehow identity is the alignment of a fundamental pair. Whereas one of the first things that one does in the jnana yoga is to learn to go more fundamental than the equation. If you're dealing with A equals A in a yoga, you're not a very good yogi. The identity, the pairedness, has to come down to the irreducible, the non-paired uniqueness, A. This point, this single pointedness, in Sanskrit is called ekagrata, one-pointedness. And the classic great yogi who developed the techniques for ekagrata was the historical Buddha. But later on, from the historical Buddha, about 800 years later, a sage in India named Patanjali developed the yoga aphorisms, and he showed that there's a technology that's capable, that consciousness can apply ekagrata, and when it does, Patanjali called it pranama. And when you apply ekagrata to the world, you transform the world. And by applying in this process of pranama your single-pointedness to the world, because the world exists in a maya, a dance of illusion, when you apply single-pointedness to the world, you set up a resolving unity that bundles into fundamental pairedness the multiplicity of the world. Literally what it does is it takes mental light and creates a world of laser clarity instead of the confused illusion, the maya. And instead of the dance being confusing, the dance becomes artistic. All of the flaming whirls of illusion become arranged in a circle through which Shiva Nataraja may dance. So this education has a very long pedigree, and though we don't mention it all that much all the time, it's well-founded in thousands of years of effective technique. In the pairedness of practice, the pair to practice has always been theory, so that one speaks of theory and practice. One says that practice has to do with what's actual, and theory has to do with what's potential. Actually, the pairing of practice and theory as a pair, as a fundamental pair, comes from the classical Greeks. The classical Greeks did not use the term theory. We get our word theory from it, but the Greek was theoria. And theoria, when you translate it, does not translate to theory. It translates to contemplation, an inner focus. So that theory is a mental objectivity, whereas practice is a bodily objectivity. Praktike in Greek, from which we would get the term praxis, doing, or pragmatos, action. So that the body is objective in its actions, the mind is objective in its focusing. So that ideas are the shapes of symbolic objectivity, and rituals are the objective shape of bodily action. So that if you have an asana, you arrange the body, but that's only the beginning of a yoga. One has to also arrange the mind. And when they are both arranged together, one says then that there is a balance. There's an equanimity. And one of the curious things about equanimity in yoga is when the body and mind are perfectly balanced, the identity, the equation, all by itself folds into a single pointedness, an ekagrata. And if you take the technological improvement of Patanjali and you apply ekagrata to itself, if you balance out a single pointedness with a single non-pointedness, you get a perfect absolute zero, which in Sanskrit is called moksha. It means that you pulled the plug on singular actuality by applying singular actuality to singular actuality, and what you came up with was not two actualities, but absolute zero. And at the time of Patanjali, in 3rd century India, was the first time that there was a development of the mathematical symbol of zero. And zero ever since has been a very important part of the order of mind and the application of an ordered mind to the world, so that theory and practice have a very interesting kind of tandem together. What happens in nature is that the perfect equanimity between theory and practice, while that produces an absolute perfect zero, when you turn that whole process inside out and you apply equanimity on the contrapositive, instead of getting zero, you get infinity. So that the objective cosmos is the absolute infinity of equanimity, which is the other side of the equanimity of body and mind. But one needs to ask here a very simple question, a first-grade question. You have to raise your hand and ask, yoga teacher of the universe, if body and mind in equanimity produce zero, what is it that in equanimity produces infinity? Answer, the cosmos itself and the objective person, the spirit, the artist in residence, the individual. So that there's something to do with individual and cosmos in equanimity that mathematically produces a perfect infinity, because it has as its effective purposiveness infinity. That whole process is called differentiation. Whereas the other, because it integrates and factors down to a basic A equals A identity, and that collapses to A, and that factors into zero, because of that process, it's called integration. One is not the ultimate of integration, it's the penultimate. It's the one step before ultimate. The ultimate of integration is zero. The ultimate of differentiation is infinity. And it turns out in some grand Wagnerian way that zero and infinity can also be brought into balance. And when you do, you get what is called reality complete. Now, one can talk this way, and if you want to be taught this way, it'll take you about 30 or 40 years of practice and learning. Have you got the time? You have to let go of all of the other stuff. Because we don't have the time, we have to do it a different way. So we do it in terms of a 2-year education. And though we're not talking about it in this way, it's an actual theory and practice brought together, and it's a real application. It has a real effect. But like any yoga, you have to do it, and you have to internalize it for it to work, for it to be real. And so one can say of this education, if you don't do it completely, to that extent it's impaired, to that extent it's not happening. Whereas if you do it, just do it, at least you have that kind of a basis. You have the practical basis upon which later you can interiorize it, you can contemplate it, and you can put it together in your own focus, in your own time. In speaking of objectivities, though, one is speaking only in terms of the four of a quaternary, of the objective phases which have their pair. And the pair in the objective phases are 4 processes, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Because the 4 processes are just as actual as the objectivities. But the 4 processes are very difficult to apprehend. They distribute themselves equally, as you would expect, in a pairedness, in an identity. Both sides of the equation sign have to be balanced. And the distribution on that equation sign is that the integration and the differentiation, in terms of process, pairs, and those pairs equal. So that when you're talking realistically about process, you have to talk about 4 of them distributed in a pair of pairs. Now this is true not only in yoga, it's true in mathematics. It's true in any effective application of reality. It doesn't matter what field you're in, what age you are, what age you live in. These are universal truths. And just like you can use the mathematics which was used in the 17th century to figure out, calculate how to use certain things, like in civil engineering, how you build a bridge or build buildings. It's the same math. This form that you're being taught is good indefinitely on any star system, in any dimension of the universe. Even if one goes to highfalutin, late 20th century superstring theory, where there are 10 dimensions, superstring theory, nevertheless, posits that of the 10 dimensions, only one of them is a time dimension. And the other 9 are space dimensions, which distribute themselves into 3 kinds of space. And each of those 3 kinds of space may have the time dimension factored in with it. So if there's a triad, there's a trinity, if you like, of space-times in superstring theory. 3 different spaces which have a common numerator of time. 3 different denominators of space. And because this is like a mathematically very precise quality of structural reality on very large cosmic scale, which the body doesn't know anything about intellectually, and most minds intellectually don't know anything about. So this kind of impress of the certainty and truth of that universal structure occurs to the mind and impresses the body in ways that we would call unconscious or subconscious. And so the 3 kinds of space that have the same factor of time are called past, present, and future. Now the present, which we've been talking about in a yogic way, is very difficult because the present happens to factor almost instantly to absolute zero or to absolute infinity. So present time space is very difficult to factor, and therefore it usually disappears instantly from view even before it's formed. It's like one of those phantom particles found in early 1997, that in chemical reactions there's an all but invisible particle that is present in chemical reactions that facilitates chemical reactions on the atomic level from being what they were to being what they now are, but that these particles of transformation disappear in fractions of picoseconds. So the detection of them was just almost impossible to have. So in terms of past, present, and future, present seems to collapse. Any Zen master knows that present collapses into moksha or infinity quicker than that. And so time distributes itself in terms of the body and the mind very nicely into past and future. And one of the problems with history, which is the 4th of the processes, the most difficult, the most differential of the 4, history distributes itself into past and future easily in terms of the body and the mind, but because of a reductive flaw that's hidden in civilization, hidden in individuals, it's like a little flaw that has been built into the psychology so long that it seems like it should be there. And it's been factored into social life so many thousands of years that it seems like it's a given. History, in a reductive way, slides and becomes a concern with the past exclusively. And it is a fatal flaw to think that history has to do with the past. One hears with great confidence world-class athletes talking about something being over, and that's history. And if you're defeated on the court, you're history. This is like broadcasting stupidity with red neon letters planet high. those guys are dumb. That's not true at all. History is equally concerned with the future. And one of the problems we faced in our lifetime is to rub our eyes and look out and understand that future history is a real problem from here on out. And that we are the second generation to face the fact that future history is as important as past history. That is, traditional history concerned with the past was at most, at best, even when perfected, only half the story. And to the extent that that was impaired, and it was impaired severely, people educated in history as a past are notoriously ineffective. There was a survey, a canvass taken, I think last year. A geographical questionnaire and a biographical questionnaire was passed out to high school graduates in the United States, and only 16% were able to identify even half of the geographical locations where they were in the world, and even less than that of who people were. So at best, that's 16% of 50%. That means 8%. And that's for high school graduates. And the mnemonic retention of those kinds of facts plummets after graduation if they aren't used. If you don't use your knowing, it atrophies quicker than muscles. So that you have mature people at the flourishing part of their life in their 40s and 50s who are operating with at best about 2% or less of what they need to deal with reality. That means if you take an IQ average of 100, you're dealing with people with an IQ of 2. So you get the idea that when somebody talks about the junkyard of this world and the ignorance, that they don't mean little bitty impairment, but they mean massive apocalyptic ignorance, stupidity. And why is the world so difficult? Because it really isn't tended. What works in this world is nature, which is none of our doing. And what works just a little bit is language, which is somewhat of our doing, but because it parallels nature, we can't go all that wrong, although we try. Where the impairment shows up are in the differential processes of vision and history. And there, the drop-off is catastrophic. The math of catastrophe theory applies beautifully to the miseducation of human beings, regardless of the age. It's just worse in our time because there are more people. If you're dealing with 2% on the integral level, you're dealing with thousandths of a percent on the differential level. So if you take 1/10,000th of 2% of 5.5 billion people, you get an idea of how many conscious human beings there are to deal with history. That's a very small number. You don't need Dodger Stadium even. Why are we having such a difficult time? Because no one is at home. I termed this lecture the 4 oceans of the world. And the 4 oceans, the 4 seas, if you wish. The 4 oceans of the world are the 4 processes that we need to look at and that our education looks at. In the first year, in the integral cycle, we looked at the process of nature and the process of myth. Myth has to do with experience. It has to do with feeling. It has to do with language. Nature is the given mystery of the matrix of change. But just as nature and myth are integral processes, there's a pair of differential processes, one of which is vision, which traditionally was called something like magic. It was called supernatural. It patterned itself on nature, but it was supernature. So vision or consciousness is one of the differential processes, the other is history. And just as nature seems to be mysterious enough in its own right, and yet we can work with it because when we let ourselves just be natural, we seem to work with nature spontaneously. What is the French phrase, en naturel? When one is participating with nature, one's own nature gets it, and you can't go very far wrong. When the body is allowed to be natural, it factors into the process of nature in a beautiful way. One of the great convincing qualities that early men and women were joyous is that they had this capacity to let the body be absorbed into the process of nature. One of the most charming of all of the Paleolithic illustrations of early man, coming from some 20,000 years ago, is of a figure running full bore with a spear, and one sees in this Paleolithic painting of man just the joy of running free, chasing his supper with all this beautiful technique. One sees the way in which the figure, even in the cave painting, is holding the spear, that the runner knows exactly how to pace his running, to have an even dynamic, and to throw the spear exactly to bring home the supper. He's going to eat, his lady and children are going to eat, his friends are going to eat, their children are going to eat. Everyone's going to eat tonight. There's this joy that man, when he participates with nature, in nature, that his physical body belongs as a pair with nature, that the objectivity of the body and the process of nature fit together. They're a fit. The first dividing line, the first threshold, is when the process of language comes into play, when myth comes into play. Because it turns out that bodies are ambidextrous. Existence is ambidextrous. Existence not only factors into nature without leaving a trace, but it also can factor into myth without leaving a trace. Rituals go with nature, but rituals also equally go with myth. Actions fit into feelings seamlessly. So that the process of myth, the process of language, absorbs existence, absorbs rituals, absorbs the actions, just like nature does, and it's no wonder because language is patterned on nature. If one wants to know what does a word mean, one goes to the ritual of pointing. The referent is there. It exists. And the existence is guaranteed because it's underwritten by nature, a process that allows for bodies to be objective, objectively real. But just as a process like nature allows bodies to be objectively real, because language is patterned on nature, it also has the capacity to allow for its own kind of objects to be objectively real. So that the realistic objects of language are symbols. And symbols are just as real as bodies. Inner objects. Now we can take this as a cue. We can look at this equation, this pair of pairs, and this great four oceans of the world, the four seas, the four processes of reality. And we can see that just as nature allows for ritual objects to have existence and to be objectively real, and just as language, as myth, as feelings allow for the symbols in the mind to be objectively real, So the two processes in the differential side of the equation must also be processes that have objectively real outcomes. And we've seen in our education that the objectively real outcome of the differential process of vision, of consciousness, is what we classically call the person. The spiritual person, the objectively real artist. Just as real as the body. And so we say, in a very almost trite kind of trilogy, that body, mind, and spirit are objectively real. The first formulation of that triad was in a civilization that flourished in Western Central Asia. The phrase was thought, word, and deed. The first written expression of that were the Gathas of Zarathustra about 4,000 years ago in the Amu Darya River civilization. Just like the Nile River had a civilization, and the Euphrates, and the Indus, and the Yangtze, well, the Amu Darya had its own civilization. Even in the New World, the Mississippi River had its civilization. Civilizations always collected early around great river systems. They were like archetypal cues for human beings, for men and women to collect in great social orders. And in the Amu Darya civilization, about 4,000 years ago, the Gathas of Zarathustra talk about thought, word, and deed. Notice here that when you say thought, word, and deed, thought is a symbol, word is a myth, deed is a ritual. Notice that the objectivity is not just on ritual and symbol, but language is given an objectivity, which it really doesn't have. One has to read deeply into something like Zarathustra or any of the figures of wisdom traditions to see that what's being said here is that word refers not to the language, but to the speaker of the language. The most encapsulated, condensed, exact, laser-like pranama, ekagrata point of the truth of that is that Jesus was called the Word. Why is he called the Word? Because the spiritual person is the speaker. Isn't a word in a language, it's word because someone is capable of speaking all the words. The speaker can say all the words. In myth, the important thing is the story. Whereas someone who speaks the words, the important thing is the storyteller. And the storyteller is a spiritually objective person who tells the story. Now, if you've ever heard a traditional tribal storyteller, a traditional tribal mythographer, they do not speak from their person. They speak from the cadence, the talking stick. They speak from the ritual basis that generates the mythos. They speak from the body. The body's rhythm speaks. It's a dance. But not a dance of the body, but the body with its rhythm stationary, so that the dance is in the process of the language. So danced, cadenced language is what myth is. And a good mythographer, a good storyteller, a tribal mythic repository, man or woman, when they tell their stories, they immerse themselves into the ritual cadence, which allows for the nature to suffuse through them osmotically into the language, so that the language becomes mysterious, just like nature is. The language of a good mythic performance is so captivating. It's like a mysterious acid which dissolves all conflict. Perhaps the most famous in the 20th century, because it's been touted and institutionalized to a great extent and broadcast around the world, whereas it's difficult to find tribal storytellers anymore. But one of the great versions of it in the 20th century is the shadow puppet play from Indonesia, the wayang. And the wayang, the shadow puppeteer, who gives you the mythology, who gives you the myths, the Ramayana mainly, or some of the Mahabharata, or some of the Puranas. The whole experience is one of immersion. And it doesn't matter in the performance of the wayang to whether you're in front of the screen. There's a sheet that's arranged with some kind of light behind it. In the old traditional times, it was candles or torches. Now it's sort of like a light bulb there, usually, or some kind of gas lantern. And there's a table which has all the cutouts of the shadow puppets. And then behind the storyteller is the gamelan orchestra. And the gamelan especially, the gamelan is like a xylophone. It's meant to be a reverberation, so that each individual reverberation blends itself, interpenetrates with others, so that what you get is a plaid sound. You get sound in an infinitely complex plaid. In fact, one could even go further. One could say it's a fractal plaid. So when the gamelan orchestra is playing, and the wayang is doing his shadow puppets, the immersion is so complete, it's so titanic, so perfect, that it doesn't matter whether you're on one side of the screen or the other. You're perfectly free to walk around. You can look at the shadows on the screen, on the sheet that's draped there, or you're quite free to walk around and watch the wayang raise up the shadows, the little puppets, free to look at the gamelan orchestra. You're also free that if you get a little tired because it goes on all night, you're free to doze. It doesn't make any difference. You may doze if you like. You may eat. You may whisper. You may walk away and go and do something else and then come back. The important point about an integral immersion is that it doesn't matter what you're doing, as long as you give yourself to that immersion, at least subconsciously. Because that's where the effectiveness is. Your body will get it. And your mind will get it. The impress will be there. And in terms of kinesis, in terms of a kinesthetic effect, in the morning when the sun comes up and the show is over, the experience of the myth of the whole night has a kinetic, kinesthetic quality. It's a cloud-like lightness. The same thing happens in very good rituals, in ancient tribal integrations. When someone goes through the 8-day Okan ceremony, which is no longer given, it's been 36 years since the last great North American Plains Indian Sundance. At the end of the 8-day Sundance ceremony, one comes away with a good feeling. We've had a good Sundance. We feel it. We feel the efficacy of it. We feel cleaned. we feel scrubbed, we feel lighthearted, we feel pure, we feel at one with nature, and our language is good, and we can talk truth with each other without even trying. But the differential processes of consciousness and history are not amenable to those kinds of experiences. They specifically do not work in those old ways, those ancient ways, those integral ways, because they are differential processes and they're the other side. They do not like ritual. They like novelty. They like something new. Instead of something tried and true, something untried and possibly untrue. So that the process of consciousness works best in terms of exploring the unknown. Instead of factoring in and participating with nature, it works in a supernatural way. This is why Tolkien said that fairy tales are extraordinarily different from myths. Myths are tribally integrative, where fairy tales are individually explorative. Fairy tales open up possibilities that never were. That famous quotation of Robert Kennedy, RFK, towards the end of what turned out to be the end of his life, he said, "There are men everywhere who dream of things that were and constantly ask of us, why? Why don't we do this? Why don't we go back?" Where there are a few individuals who ask not why, but they ask why not. Let's look at possibilities that are unknown, the forms of things unknown. And one of the great forms of things unknown is the exploration not only of consciousness as a differential process, but the even more complex process of history, the future. And future history is the exact half that's needed to balance past history and to show that history is not concerned with the past at all. It's concerned with reshaping the past so that it balances an ever-opening future possibility. The future history is one of open possibility, not of closed situation. How then does it get misidentified with the past? It does so because it undergoes a radical regression. Any sane yogi will tell you the world is crazy. It is clinically crazy. And to try and be healthy in terms of a crazy world is in itself an ultimate craziness. Let's take a break. One easy way to make the distinction between integral processes and differential processes is to use a very simple designation. Taking the cue from nature. Nature is a mysterious process. We don't know exactly what it is. It's not that we don't know, but we know that we will never know. Nature is truly mysterious because nature is not objective. Nature's objectivity dissolves before our penetrating glance. If you say atoms are the fundamental objects of nature, well, you can go subatomic now. If you say particles, one can shift mathematically from particles to waves instantly without damaging the math. And waves disappear into the cosmic ether without leaving a factorable trace. So nature is now known to be a mysterious process that cannot be objectified, yet it can be analyzed by consciousness. So conscious analysis is not stymied by mystery, it thrives on mystery. Language is also mysterious because it's very much like nature. So one can say that integral processes are mysterious. Nature and language, fundamentally, structurally mysterious. Whereas the differential processes are fundamentally social. But whereas vision tends to want to have some kind of outcome in an individual, history tends to want to have an outcome in terms of an all, an ecumenical all. So history involves the many, and vision involves the one and the many. And so the social polarity of differential processes involves something to do with humans, something to do with us. Or I guess now in a post-Roswell world, one can say any conscious beings anywhere in the universe will deal with the way in which vision and history structure their social relationalities. So that there are societies on the tribal level, but there are sociologies on the differential level. It's a very interesting kind of distinctiveness. One can say that if you study a tribal ecology, one names that then an anthropology, study of man. This is a misnomer. One is really not studying man. What one is studying is the effect of the integral processes of nature and language on the integral objectivities of ritual and symbol. That's what one is studying. And if one's study seems to be about the processes of consciousness and history and the objectivities of individuals and worldviews, then one has a sociology. And one says, well, anthropology is a study of natural-based and sociology of conscious-based experience. But even that kind of language is misleading because essentially experience always occurs on the mythic level. Experience is always a process, never objective. So the very use of language that we have is inculcated with structural impossibilities, with not only errors, but with impossibilities, with chimeras, with nonsense. So that when one becomes more exacting, cultivated to the point to where you can really mean what you say, you become more and more aware. In fact, it's an asymptotic curve. It means it rises right off the graph. You become more and more aware that you're compromised always by the language which is rooted in myth and especially does not apply, has no traction whatsoever in history. And the reason for this is a structural impossibility, which we've talked about many times. And that is the most that our attention can keep track of structurally is a frame of reference, a square of attention, as we've talked about. Now, that square, those four sides, are at most a pair of objectivities and a pair of processes. And that when you line up the processes and the alternate objectivities, you'll see that when history comes into play, myth goes out of the square of attention, goes out of the frame of reference. So that for history, the baseline of its operability are symbols. Whereas when myth is within the square of attention, it never extends further than art. So that there is a great crisis for the tribes when historical processes begin to happen. And tribal structures do not survive a confrontation with historical societies. It's as simple as saying, when tribal peoples meet organized civilizations, it's the tribes that crumble, not the civilizations. What crumbles civilizations are the inability to meet the challenges of history. Arnold Toynbee, who studied civilizations, showed that not a single civilization has ever survived its confrontation with history. They've all failed. None of them survived. And so this is not very good news. Yet there's still this quality, even there in Toynbee, in his reconsiderations. He says the fundamental dynamic is between challenge and response. That's not a question of the challenge so much being too much, but it's always a question of the response not being enough. And that the reason why the response is not enough, he put his finger on it. He used an ordinary English phrase. He called it a failure of nerve. All civilizations have died because of a failure of nerve. Because the men and women have given up responding to the challenge, whereas the challenge, being rather impersonal, doesn't care whether you give up or not. It is what it is. And if you try to step aside, it just sweeps you aside. So we know now that there's no question of giving up and returning back to some pleasant when, way back when. Because now the way back when is rather like a shark's mouth. It was very easy going in. It tears you when you try to come back out. The teeth are slanted. It's very easy to go in. It's when you try to come back out that you're lacerated. So that the situation that we're in is not resolvable by regression. It's not resolvable by forgetting about it. It is only resolvable in terms of a response that meets the challenge, at least in some kind of a realm of within the ball game. And apparently one of the blessings is we do not have to win, we just have to meet it. My yogic inspection of the problem shows that, in fact, if you look for victory, you will lose, because the object is not to win, but to regain equilibrium. To have the response not beat the challenge, but to meet the challenge. So the wise person in a yogic consciousness doesn't play to win, he plays to continue to play. This is very difficult to teach, because the society inculcates, are you going to be a loser or a winner? And to just draw even is considered to be milquetoast. This is stupid. Where it is exactly where wisdom always has put it. You can consult any wisdom tradition at any time in human recorded history, and you will find this. Krishna tells Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, You do not go into battle because you're afraid, you're scared. And in that timeless split second, on the field of Kurukshetra, before the battle begins, Krishna says to Arjuna, you are the greatest warrior of the time. What you do is you fight. It has nothing to do with fighting and killing your relatives, and you don't want to do this. It has nothing to do with karma. It has nothing to do with any of these things, except you as a warrior in this situation fight. It's not that you must fight or you need to fight, it's what you do. It's who you are. And that you fight makes all of it real, and the outcome will be what it will be. You don't have to be concerned with the fruits of action. Because the penetrative yogic understanding is you're not fighting to win, you're fighting to be who you are. And you are, as a warrior, if you were something else, then you would be that. Bhishma cannot be defeated in battle. It's not that he's such a great warrior, it's just simply that's his nature in the Bhagavad Gita, in the Mahabharata. So it's fruitless to try and fight him to kill him. You do not fight him to kill him. You fight to pull even with his capacity of unbeatability, and that neutralizes him. So one has to be a little smarter than stupid in order to get the idea that the future belongs not to those who win, but to those who are going into the future, win, lose, or draw. There's a beautiful scene in a very early film by Raoul Walsh called The Big Trail, starring a 18-year-old John Wayne. The wagon train that's been moving west, and they're in this snowstorm in the Donner Pass, and they're ready to do what the Donner Party did, kill some to eat them so that they can or survive or to go back. And he leans against his rifle and says, it's not a question of whether we get through or not in terms of our capacity, but we were brought this far by a wave of exploration, and that's what we're doing. So we'll just continue. That's what we do. And those who come after us will carry on that wave of actuality. So it's that kind of a quality. That's kind of the Big Trail was 1930, and it was a time when in the United States there had to be a practical reassessment of what's going on. By the summer of 1930, the United States was actually in a situation where they realized that the game plan of the 20s had come to a complete crash because it was unrealistic. It was not real at all. It had no basis in reality whatsoever. And the 1930s in the United States is characterized by a blank, truthful confrontation of men and women with reality. And you find this realistic quality. Not only do you find it in the United States, but you find it around the world in the 1930s. And one of the most profound places that you find it, philosophically, in the United States it was a social realism, but the place that had it in a philosophical way was Germany. And it's in the Germany of the 1930s that one finds a very realistic philosophic assessment. And in retrospect, one looks back and says, well, this is the National Socialist decade. No, that was one of the outcomes. Equal to it was a very clear assessment on the other side that the real predator was the process of history. and that one had to come somehow philosophically into the ability to deal with it. Now, philosophy is a combination of symbol and vision. When you pair symbol and vision together, then you have philosophy. When you pair symbol and myth together, you get tradition. So symbols can go with myth and make tradition, or they can go with vision and make philosophy. So philosophy and tradition have a common relationality in symbols. Just like philosophy, which is symbol and vision, knit together. When you have vision and art brought together, then art becomes the discipline of the moment. And so one sees that philosophy is like an interface between tradition and art. Whereas tradition looks to conserve, art looks to explore. Tradition concerns itself with getting in tune with the mystery of nature. Art wants to get in tune with the exploration of the unknown. Tradition is respectful of the universe, whereas art is inquisitive about the cosmos. The artist would like to continue to explore, whereas the mythographer is not exploring so much as participating. Philosophy is in between symbol and vision. The German intellectual philosophy of the 1930s is poignant. And one of the most poignant minds of that time was Ernst Cassirer. Ernst Cassirer, whose book on myth and language we used back in the myth section. In 1936, when he was 60 years old, there was a Festschrift. There was a collection of essays for Ernst Cassirer in Berlin. And this Festschrift was called Philosophy and History because it concerned the problems of the time, of the moment. And here's the beginning sentences of a couple of the essays that were here. Here is the beginning sentences of an essay, The Transcending of Time in History, by an Italian philosopher, Giovanni Gentili, who was an Italian Hegelian at the time. He writes, "Reality is spirit, and spirit never is, but is always coming to be. Not something given, but a free activity. That is what distinguishes it from nature. And such being its essence, spirit, which is identical with reality, is history, or the process of self-realization." And the first few sentences of The Philosophic Character of History, Raymond Klebanski, a Polish philosopher of the time, who became a collector of essays on Carl Jung later on. "The increasing predominance of dividing forces of understanding over the unifying forces of faith, understanding and faith, integral and differential. The increasing predominance of the dividing forces of understanding over the unifying forces of faith brought about a loosening of the spirit of the strict hierarchy of all provinces of thought." In other words, integration was to formulate and preserve and integrate, whereas consciousness is interested not in integrating at all. When one says one is going to find ultimate integration of self by consciousness, that's nonsense. No one ever found themselves by integrating. If you're really good at integrating like the Buddha, what you find is moksha. It's exactly what you find. You find pure zero. Madame Sophia, in ghostly phantom blue, says with a galaxy-wide smile, 0. You never find yourself that way. Where do you find yourself? You find yourself on what the Buddha called the other shore. And on the other shore, there you are as a differential form. But differential forms are not at all like existential forms. They have nothing to do with existence. They have everything to do with possibility. So the nicest thing you can say is that the spiritual person is like a prism. Like a phantom prism that isn't there. All you see is the spectrum. All you see is the range of possibility. You don't see the person at all. And because you do not see the person, that's proof that you're seeing in the right way. This is called having no graven images of God before you. If you have an image of God before you, you got it wrong. If you see the white beard, you got it wrong. If you see it's masculine, wrong. If you see it's feminine, wrong. It's like Dennis Hopper, right? Wrong. Wrong. It's that kind of equality that differential forms are naturally supernatural, which means that then they're supernaturally transcendent to existence, which means that they're always invisible. The fact that you can't see a spiritual form is the fact that that's what it is. If it could be visualized, if you visualize a spiritual form, you have reduced it. So all the nice little New Age techniques of visualizing for spiritual purposes are reductive. That's going back to the mythic level. That's where images are. So if you see angels, or you can draw pictures of angels, you know that you're very safely tucked in myth. And that you are sitting duck for historical processes that have no trouble whatsoever steamrolling over people who are pleasantly ensconced in myth. It's like one of the great fairy tales of the 20th century, written during the Second World War, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. The little hobbits are very nice in their shire. But the problem is not with the shire. The problem is that Sauron, the Dark Lord, is rolling over the landscape with powers that the Shire has no ability to deal with. And yet the individual personal essence of the Shire in the person of Frodo or his companion Sam is exactly the penetrating quality that the Dark Lord has no defense against. In Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, the Dark Lord has every advantage if you're dealing with him in terms of power. He eats power. And the more power you have, the more he has you. Power is his métier. What in Buckaroo Banzai, what does Lord Worfen say? More power to you? The more power you have, the more we can work with you. Because we own power. You're using our energy. We can bill you anytime. But the hobbits do not work with power. They work with an immunity to power. That's why Frodo and Sam get through. It doesn't make any difference. They're not after power. They're not affected by it. What does Han Solo say? Never quote me the odds. It's that kind of a conundrum. It's a mysterious, paradoxical conundrum. It's like one of those Chinese puzzles where you put your fingers in and the more you struggle, the tighter it is. The secret is non-struggling and yet careful removal. So that when you get into a bind with a historical challenge, with a differential process challenge, the way out is not to overpower it. The way out is through equanimity. That's what Krishna tells Arjuna. Don't struggle. You're fighting against being a warrior. It's what you are. When you do not struggle, when you meet the challenge of being a warrior by being who you are, a warrior, the resolution of it will happen in reality, and that's all that needs to happen. Not your version of it or someone else's version of it. Those are ideological regressions that really lodge themselves into a refactored kind of an integration, not just an integration that belongs to nature, but a recalibrated reintegration that belongs to regressed consciousness that seeks to redo ritual according to a platform, to redo myth according to party, to redo the symbols according to an ideology. So that all political forms are regressive errors. All political parties of any color whatsoever are factorable errors. So one has to ask a very intelligent question. How do we then work? Very good question. We have to find ways in which differential forms of individual spiritual persons can work in social groups without recurring back to isms or doctrines, without becoming ideological. And this is a very real problem. It's unsolved. About one of the great steps forward to solving it came from some little Frodo-like yogis in the 20th century in India. Gandhi was very much like a Frodo. He learned to be effective without power. He learned not to win, but to meet a situation exactly. Satyagraha is not to beat your opponent, but to create the reality between the two of you. And what results is sarvodaya. Not service to the majority, not victory to the powerful, but sarvodaya means all, everybody. And no Gandhian decision is taken until everyone is consulted and everyone is together. Not together in terms of an ism, but together in terms of their individual understanding and assessments of what's real. And when it's unanimous, then it's done. Whereas the ideologue says, that's exactly the problem. We can never be in unanimity. That's proof positive that we need to bend arms, and if need be, to bend whole geographies. And so the 20th century has been immersed and inured in this kind of a struggle, and it's not over. Just because the formulation of its battle in terms of the shadow puppet play of the Cold War is no longer operating because a certain kind of a dawn has come and the Wei Yang stopped that puppet show, doesn't mean that it's over. It just means it's in a more pernicious state. Instead of being comfortably objectivized so that you can be pro or con, the conflict now is in a completely differential historical invisibility, very much there. And it manifests itself in negative printouts. It manifests itself as resistances. Try to do something conscious, and you will see that we're immersed in an acid of resistance. Not one single simple thing can be done without resistances being engendered. It's a symptom right on time. It's a quality which one recognizes if you're a doctor of civilization. We've had this disease a lot of times before. And this is what the symptoms are. This is what the disease is. What's the prescription? exercise, good diet, and a cheerful response to the situation. This is very difficult because the recipient of this Festschrift, Philosophy and History, in 1936, was challenged severely by the Nazis in Germany. In fact, he left. Came to the United States. He went to Yale University eventually. And right at the end of his life, when Tolkien was writing Lord of the Rings, Ernst Cassirer was writing one of his greatest books called The Myth of the State. Because he had seen it firsthand, he had understood it firsthand for a long life. And Cassirer wrote The Myth of the State. It was finished just before he died in April of 1945. It was published in 1946. And almost like a complement, almost like a pair to it, The Myth of the State was paired with an essay on man. And they were both published at the same time. The Myth of the State written in German, Essay on Man written in English. It was like a person with this kind of integrity. It was like a Tolkien in philosophy. Cassirer understood that there was a moment where the complications of language were so much a part of the situation that he wrote 2 books as a pair in 2 different languages, which were both sides of the combatants, the major combatants of the Second World War. English language and German language. It was like Cassirer's profound understanding that had come as the result of several centuries of German excellence in philosophy. From the time of Leibniz in the late 1600s to the time of Cassirer in the mid-1900s, German philosophic thought was one of the treasures of the world. And right in the middle, between Leibniz, who founded the most effective universal language we have, which is higher mathematics, based on calculus. Calculus, which is differential and integral, 2 different modes. Calculus was made to be a universal language of truth. And though Sir Isaac Newton also developed calculus at exactly the same time, notice German and English, as paired languages of an ultimate truth language, higher mathematics. It's Leibniz's notation that we use today and not Newton's. Newton used a symbolic version of an old mythographic solution, whereas Leibniz used a conscious, visionary version of the symbols. And it's Leibniz's notation that is used today because it's the one that yields development. But in between Leibniz and Cassirer, there are 2 great German philosophers who lived simultaneously at the same time that are exactly the same watershed that happened in ancient Greece, in classical Greece. The watershed between Plato and Aristotle was rekindled again between Kant and Hegel. Now, Cassirer was a Kantian, like Carl Jung is a Kantian. But Kant's solutions, his emphasis, is on the process of vision, on the process of consciousness. Hegel took what Plato took. He took the higher challenge of the process of history. And it's exactly on the misappropriation of Hegel's solutions to the process of history philosophically that Kantians like Cassirer take Hegel to task. That he opened a Pandora's box which was not controllable. not containable. And it is the misuse of Hegelian understandings of history that lead to the problems of not only the Nazis, but of the Soviet Empire. Marxism, Marxist-Leninism. They're both versions of a misappropriation of Hegel. So that one finds, in the myth of the state, towards the end, there is a chapter which is simply called Hegel. Just like in one of the great German philosophic historians, Karl Lowith, his famous book, Meaning in History, the theological implications of the philosophy of history, has a great chapter on Hegel. If we look at these two chapters on Hegel, just the first sentences right away tell us that we're in the ball game for the first time. Sir, the title of the chapter is Hegel. The subtitle is The Influence of Hegel's Philosophy Upon the Development of Modern Political Thought. Political thought. Here's the opening sentences. No other philosophic system has exerted such a strong and enduring influence upon political life as the metaphysics of Hegel. All the great philosophers before him had propounded theories of the state which had determined the general course of political thought, but played only a very modest role in political life. In other words, there were very powerful philosophic systems, like Plato's. And they sought to put it into practice, and it never really happened. Plato went to the island of Sicily, which in his time was the Wild West of Greece. And he had the attention, the ear of Dionysius of Syracuse, who was the tyrant, young tyrant, and he was going to put Plato's ideas into action, and then he wanted to do his version, and Plato kept making snide remarks, probably, about how you're misunderstanding, and 3 times Plato tried to do this. None of them were effective. 700 years later, Plotinus got into the same position. He had in his classes, in his home in Rome, Aurelian, who was the Roman emperor, his wife, all of the influential senators. They were all set to build a philosophic city in the Campania, down in the south of Rome, just before you get to where Naples is. They're going to build a great philosophic city and try Plotinus's Neoplatonic structure of life. And a plague hit Rome. Plotinus died of diphtheria. Aurelian was murdered and deposed, and it never happened. But Hegel's philosophic ideas about history were put into practice in the 20th century, especially by Germany and by the Soviet Union. Casur lived through the debacle of what happens when powerful philosophic systems that are meant to deal with history are regressed and turned inside out and are made myths of the state and used as integral methods which, instead of freeing people to be differential, I forget the German word the Nazis always use. It means conformity. Everyone must conform. Because the only way we have power is if everyone is aligned exactly the same. It's an inside-out misunderstanding. Instead of the spiritual quality of Hegel's thought, one gets it turned upside down. One gets the exact negative. One gets the exact reverse. One gets a regression. And instead of consciousness being free, consciousness becomes the ultimate warden of an imprisonment that's not detectable because it's using differential, applied ideas, theory applied, there's no defense against it. On the tribal level, there's no way that anyone can meet that kind of a challenge. It's not that the armament of the Nazis overran the ineffective armament of other peoples, is that the ideology was more powerful than the tribal ideas, so-called, brought to bear. Loweth, in his section on Hegel, brings Hegel back not in its reductive, regressed terms that happened here for Cassura in his lifetime, and writing the book during the Second World War, trying to make sense out of this. Here's Loweth. In his introduction to the Lectures on the Philosophy of History, Hegel, in 1830, Hegel describes world history as it appears at first glance. This is a translation of Hegel exactly. This is the year before Hegel died. He died of illness prematurely in his early 60s. We see a vast picture of changes and transactions, of maniform forms of people, states, individuals in unresting succession. On every hand, aims are adopted and pursued. In all these occurrences and changes, we behold human action and suffering predominant. Everywhere something akin to ourselves, and therefore everywhere something that excites our interest for or against. Sometimes we see the more comprehensive mass of some general interest advancing with comparative slowness and subsequently sacrificed to an infinite complication of trifling circumstances and so dissipated into atoms. Then again, with a vast expenditure of power, a trivial result is produced. It's like putting hundreds of millions of dollars into a film about a karate champion who just simply beats people up in a nice fashion that's new. Trivial result. While from what appears unimportant, a tremendous issue proceeds. Something that seems just throwawayable, forgettable, is the actual opening out of an exhausted nonsense of a line of development that continues to unfold and be efficacious. Like the whole development of Satyagraha and Sarvodaya came out of a simple little dispute over indigo growing in a section of northern India called Champaran. And Gandhi went on invitation of the starving, dispossessed individuals, the little farmers who, like in the Magnificent Seven or the Seven Samurai, had sent a deputation to the top differential consciousness on the planet at the time. They went and besieged Gandhi to come and do what you can do because we're all dying. They won't let us plant anything except indigo, so we have no food, and they've begun using artificial dyes in the textile mills of England, and they're not using our indigo, and so we have nothing. We have nothing at all. And people are dying by the dozens each day, by the hundreds each week, and by the thousands every month. And Gandhi went as a differential conscious warrior. He didn't know what to do, because you don't know what to do. But like Krishna observed in the Bhagavad Gita, you go, and you do what you can. And so the only thing that he could do is he began to collect testimony, life stories of dying people. And when the young, well-dressed, collegiate Indians like Nehru came in their beautiful cars to say, what can we do to help? He said, you can stay and take testimony. And after a couple of months, there were several thousand Indians, men and women, taking testimony of several hundreds of thousands of Champaran people, and the world began to notice something's going on here. Well, what is it? Well, they're just taking testimony, but they're taking it by the billions of words. And eventually the pressure forced the British Empire to stop the illusion, the nonsense, and let the people grow food for themselves at least, and then everything changed. And out of that was born Satyagraha. Out of that was born Gandhian modern India, not only modern India. A third of all of Sri Lanka is run by Gandhian descendants, Dr. Aryaratna and his people. And today, in the state of Bihar, about 80 million Indians in just that province alone are governed by non-government or organized by non-political parties. They're not run by the Congress Party. All the land is held in a universal trust. And those who work the land work it to feed themselves, to market a certain quality of product in a certain quantity, to receive in trade what they need, and the rest of it is increment to make sure that new lands can be added to this trust. Bihar is the old province of the Buddha, and that was the origin of the phrase a number of decades ago. One Buddha BC, one Gandhi AD. So there are techniques that work, that don't depend upon politics. But the difficulty is that the mind and the civilization that encases us, both the deepest insides of us and the largest outsides of us, are blind to these possibilities because they don't know of them. It's the very nature and structure of ideologies that they cannot know about these because these are differential forms, differential processes. And ideologies are always regressed. They always take the energies of consciousness and take it back into ritual and redevelop out of that regressed ritual a new kind of mythology called the politics, which becomes a new kind of symbol called the ideology. And this is one of the problems, that in the 20th century we are caught in one of those Chinese puzzles. There is no way out by continuing along the same line of development. The Cold War was but a graphic example in a very cartoon version of the only possible future that comes out of that. It's not zero, it's called nil. That there is no possibility for life whatsoever. With universal atomic power, with universal genetic cloning, in another generation or so, there will be no chance whatsoever. None. So if there is to be a future history, that future history has to be seeded and started in some small way. Relentless, realistic response to the actual challenge. Not to win, but to meet it. And that's what's going on here. And just because it isn't famous doesn't mean it isn't true. The only things that are famous in a nightmare are the regressed demons. Because the only thing that shows up. The explosions and the demons. And to have a taste for those is to have a taste for madness. You can do that if you want, but you know the end result of that already. Let's end with a look at what's coming up. We're going to come next week back to Franklin and Thucydides. In Thucydides, we're going to take a look at the individual who flipped-flopped and was on both sides. His name was Alcibiades. Alcibiades, who was the most flagrant personality of his time. In order to help you get the flavor of Alcibiades, not just to read about him in Thucydides, but take a look at Plutarch's Life of Alcibiades, and take a look at the character of Alcibiades in Plato's dialogue, The Symposium. He was the most colorful figure in the Athens of that day. And it is Alcibiades in Thucydides who is the key to the way in which Thucydides' history was split in exactly a schizophrenic half. The first half of Thucydides' history is all about power. It's all about generals and battles. The second half is all about individuals and how one really convincing bad individual can be much more destructive than any effective military force. Thucydides balanced his history on the way in which collective force seems to be the issue in a historical war, but actually it's the power of single individuals, finally only one, that is the real gauge of where the battle goes. Incidentally, there was no winner of the Peloponnesian War. Athens and Sparta both exhausted themselves. Athens became a university town after that, and Sparta became an abandoned village. And they never again either had power in the world. Athens ended up condemning its great philosopher Socrates to death, and Sparta ended up by disremembering any of its war heroes as they were irrelevant. So we're going to take Thucydides, Alcibiades, and we're going to pair up Alcibiades via Thucydides with Benjamin Franklin. One of the qualities of Franklin that I would like you to review is the fact that Franklin began with writing a history and stopped it in 1771. Part 1 ends about page 57, and Part 2 begins on page 58. I want you to read around in Franklin's transition between Part 1 and 2. He ends Part 1 by showing that the beginnings of his independence was when he bought out his partners around 1729, and that at the same time one of his first great commercial successes was the printing of money. The development of paper money is one of the outcomes of Benjamin Franklin's independence. He was a printer. He didn't print just books and pamphlets. He printed money. And paper money begins with Benjamin Franklin at that time. The whole philosophy of currency, of paper money, which is the origin of electronic money, which is the origin of power in the modern world, is all intimately tied up with the personality of Benjamin Franklin. You didn't know, did you? You didn't know Americans came in that variety. Well, it's time to grow up. And read the beginnings of Part 2. Part 2 is all about his realizing that his autobiography had some kind of conscious magic for people and that he should continue it. So Part 2 is Benjamin Franklin in a super self-conscious way, beginning not just to continue his history, but widening it up to become a cosmic differential process. He's also the author of that kind of a technique. The fact that he wrote Part 2 and his last year in Paris is just indicative of the power, because out of Franklin's last year in Paris came the whole development that led to the French Revolution. So money and European revolutions have something to do with the same character. And it's all available to you if you can read English. And tear yourself away from the illusion that this is boring. What's really boring is that so many people consider it boring.